Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Benjamin Rode. I'm a senior fellow at the IISS, and I'm the editor of the Adelphi book series. And I'm delighted to be chairing this online launch of the latest Adelphi book, Planning for Protraction, a historically informed approach to great power war and Sino-US competition, written by Iskander Rehman and published today. IISS members, of course, will automatically receive a copy of the book. If you're not yet fortunate to be an IISS member, then you can purchase the book from Amazon, and participants in this webinar will receive a code for 20% off discount at Routledge. I should mention that due to a unexplained technical error, we have a slight issue with the Routledge and the Amazon pages today, but that should be resolved tomorrow. So your code will still be operational then. And in any case, the Kindle copies are available to download instantaneously now. I want to thank, firstly, Iskander for this book, which I found a magnificent read and a great pleasure to edit. I also want to thank all of the IISS teams across our many departments who helped make it possible in editorial, in design, and communications. And I want to give a special thanks to the associate editor, Alice Averson. We're lucky to be joined today by two distinguished discussants, our own Meia Nouwens, our senior fellow for Chinese security and defense policy, and the Economist defense correspondent, Shashank Joshi. So Iskander will speak first for about 10 to 15 minutes to introduce the book's main themes and arguments, and then we'll turn to Meia and Shashank will each speak for about 10 minutes. Meia will talk for a bit about the implications of her research on Chinese thought about protracted war with the US, perhaps, and the extent to which Beijing's understanding about the likely nature of a conflict aligns with Iskander's. And Shashank will think a little bit about some of the defense implications for US and Western states of Iskander's analysis. We'll then go straight into Q&A, and we hope to have and expect to have a kind of lively discussion and debate. So ahead of the Q&A, please type any questions or comments you might have into the chat function below on Zoom. I think my colleague now is showing a little illustration about how to do that. And while he's doing that, let me introduce our distinguished author and first speaker. Dr. Iskander Rehman is an Axon Johnson Institute for Statecraft and Diplomacy postdoctoral fellow at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. He is also the senior fellow for strategic studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. His work focuses on applied history, grand strategy, and US defense strategy in Asia. He was formerly the senior fellow for international relations at the Pelf Center for International Relations and Public Policy at Salve Regina University. He's held many fellowships, including the Brookings Institution's Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States, as well as this fine book. He has published think tank monographs, book chapters, and articles in a wide range of journals, including Survival and the Washington Quarterly, and is contributing editor and regular writer for War on the Rocks. Iskander, please take it away.
Thanks for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be with you here today to talk about planning for protraction. And at the outset, I'd like to begin by thanking Ben Rode, Alice Averson, and the rest of IISS's editorial team for the work they've put into this book. It's been an absolute delight to work with such dedicated and meticulous editors. Thanks also to my two fellow panelists, Shashank Joshi and Meia Nouwens. I realize the news cycle is a little bit slow at the moment and nothing much seems to be going on in the world, but I nevertheless appreciate them taking some time out of their schedules to share their own thoughts on what I think we can all agree has become an increasingly salient and timely issue within the defense and military studies community, protracted great power war. Now, this has been a research project that has been a protracted process in and of itself, a labor of love, a long time in the making. I actually started working on these issues during the pandemic, producing a series of monographs for the US Department of Defense's Office of Net Assessment, which was a form of internal think tank to the Department of Defense. The goal was to engage over the course of about a year and a half in a detailed examination of past protracted high-intensity conflicts, from the Punic Wars to the 100 Years' War, to the Franco-Spanish Wars of the early modern era, to the First and Second World Wars, et cetera, et cetera. And the aim was to tease out certain shared principles or common explanatory factors of past great power actors' successes or failures in protracted broken back warfare, with an eye to applying these various insights to the current Sino-US military competition. Now, already at the time, the major global upheavals tied to COVID-19 had cast a harsh and often unflattering light on the brittleness of US and allied defense industrial bases, on their acute vulnerability to sudden economic downturns and workforce disruptions, to the fragility and tenuousness of global supply chains. And since then, the war in Ukraine, with its prodigious consumption of munitions, fuel, and materiel, has only heightened concern in US defense circles over the nation's state of preparedness for future wars. Now, of course, everyone writes and frets about munition stocks, supply chains, and shipyard capacity, and rightly so, as we can discuss in greater depth later. Yet for all the shared declarations of anxiety over the parlous state of the defense industrial base, it's not clear to me that beyond these more immediate material and industrial concerns, we are necessarily thinking more deeply and strategically about what a protracted great power war against a major peer competitor would fully entail, operationally, societally, diplomatically, politically. And I'd argue that whereas during the Cold War, defense intellectuals devoted substantial attention to prevailing the long twilight struggle against the Soviet Union and to planning across varied time horizons, current thinking on protracted competition, let alone on the issue of protracted warfare, still remains somewhat underdeveloped. So this book seeks to modestly aid in this collective process of mental adjustment, first by providing an empirically grounded study of protracted great power war, and then by applying the various collated insights to the current Sino-US military competition. Why the focus on China? Well, simply because there is now a clear bipartisan consensus that the PRC constitutes the US's most formidable long-term competitor, or to employ current US DoD jargon, its prime pacing threat. From its militarization of disputed islets in the South China Sea to its unabashed use of economic coercion against countries ranging from South Korea to Australia and Mongolia, China's become ever more assertive in its near abroad. The Department of Defense, in its most recent report on Chinese military power, notes, for example, that over the past 2 years, the PLA has engaged in more coercive and risky intercepts against US aircraft than in the previous decade combined. Meanwhile, Beijing's long-standing model of authoritarian governance, centered on collective decision-making and an orderly succession process, has precipitously crumbled. President Xi's shift towards a strongman style of rule has been accompanied by an evolution of Chinese discourse and internal politics, all of which point to a more combative, jingoistic, and embattled regime. And Washington's concerns over the PRC's trajectory have been compounded by certain disquieting signals that its urge to forcibly reshape the regional order, most notably with regard to the long-festering issue of Taiwan, has been steadily growing and may now be reaching boiling point, with upcoming Taiwanese elections injecting an extra dose of volatility. But at the same time, there's a growing recognition that the key assumptions that have undergirded US force planning and defense doctrine throughout much of the post-Cold War era, most notably the notion that technology-fueled advances in combat velocity will automatically lead to great power wars that are shorter, sharper, and more localized, may no longer prove valid. Instead, an increasing number of knowledgeable observers have begun to warn that, to the contrary, armed conflict with a Eurasian behemoth as large, wealthy, and militarily redoubtable as China could morph into something very different, a protracted struggle that evolves into a grueling war of attrition, spanning multiple theaters and drawing on all dimensions of national power. And yet, despite this growing realization of the potential for protraction, US and Chinese military doctrine still place an overwhelming emphasis on blinding campaigns, on rapidly seizing the initiative, and on combat speed in an era marked by the diffusion of precision strike and an increased dependence on exquisite multi-layered C4ISR networks. Indeed, in many ways, Chinese and American operational preferences are remarkably similar. Both put a premium on striking first and controlling the initiative. What happens, though, when two such battle networks interlocking fields of fire arrayed against each other like two nervously twitching duelists in an ice-rimed field in a Tolstoy novel? For various reasons which I outline in depth in the first section of the book, amid a high-stakes military crisis, each party would find itself under extreme pressure to seize the first mover advantage by initiating a preemptive assault on its opponent's C4ISR architecture. Operating under a shared cult of the offensive and riven with similar use it or lose it anxieties, China and the US could thus find themselves catapulted into the throes of a mutual blinding campaign. And the question, and one that this book tries to grapple with, is what happens the day after, once both battered, sensorially impaired pugilists groggily face off in a casualty-stricken and communications-degraded environment. And as I lay out in the first section of the book, neither the political nor the operational dimensions of the Sino-US security dynamic render a short, sharp war very likely. Now, in accordance with the tradition of net assessments, the analysis presented in this book aims to be comprehensive and multidisciplinary in nature. It focuses on identifying key areas of asymmetry or competitive advantage. It seeks to elucidate both short and long-term trends in the US-China rivalry, and it assumes that this rivalry is interactive rather than static. And its findings are intended first and foremost to form an aid to judgment, and thus to be more diagnostic than openly prescriptive. Does the fact that both countries possess robust and, in the case of China, rapidly growing nuclear arsenals mean that it is unlikely that they will ever go to war? I argue that in the case of the Sino-US security dynamic, it can be extremely difficult to gauge what kind of role nuclear deterrence might play on pre- or intra-war deterrence dynamics. One reason is that there appears to be a great deal of ambiguity and even perhaps confusion in Chinese thinking on matters of nuclear deterrence and escalation dynamics, or what they term war control. Indeed, many sinologists have pointed to the seeming underdevelopment of Chinese thinking on these issues, particularly in comparison, for example, to Soviet nuclear theorists during the Cold War. And second, as the book argues, it remains difficult to ascertain whether both countries' possession of nuclear weapons in and of itself reduces the possibility of a protracted conventional war, or somewhat perversely renders it more likely. Indeed, arguments can and have been advanced in both directions. But all things considered, the fact that neither great power competitor seems to view the nuclear dimension of their rivalry as being somewhat antithetical to the prosecution of large-scale and ambitious military strategies means that we still have to spend time focusing on protracted conventional war. And this grim reality strongly suggests that the potential for such an event has not been neutralized in and of itself by the joint possession of nuclear weapons. Now, in the very limited time I've left, and in the interest of preserving time and topics for our group discussions, I'm not going to try and rehash here the entirety of the content of the book. Instead, I thought I would just very briefly glide over some of its core themes before passing the baton on to the two discussants. So the first somewhat sobering but altogether unsurprising observation is that protracted great power wars are immensely destructive, whole of society affairs, the effects of which typically extend well beyond their point of origin, spilling across multiple regions and siphoning huge amounts of personnel, material, and resources. And when thinking about how to prevail in such draining marathons, neat quantifiable metrics such as ships, munitions stockpiles, and logistical inventories certainly matter, but so do less easily measurable factors, what Sir Michael Howard famously termed the forgotten dimensions of strategy, such as a state's capacity for innovation, its societal resilience, and the quality and robustness of its alliance. And final victory, this book has argued, rests on a combination of three core factors: a state's military effectiveness and adaptability, its socioeconomic power and resiliency, and the soundness of its alliance management and grand strategy. A detailed comparative analysis of Beijing and Washington based on these three factors has shown that Washington seems quite well positioned to ultimately prevail, contrary to what some vocal declinists may believe. The world's oldest democracy remains its largest and most innovative economy. Indeed, despite the meteoric ascent of China and other Asian juggernauts such as India, the United States' share of global GDP somewhat remarkably remains the same as it was in the early 1990s, at the height of the so-called unipolar era. And the geopolitical fundamentals of its continued primacy remain strong: its favored geographical position, its abundant natural resources and relatively healthy demographic profile, and its unparalleled network of allies and bases across the globe. And to this one can add its newfound status since 2019 as a net energy exporter, and the continued dominance of the dollar as the global reserve currency. And its formidable armed forces remain by far the world's most experienced, and appear by virtue of their training, command structure, and doctrinal philosophy to be in a much better position to engage in rapid intra-war adaptation than their PLA counterparts. Indeed, protracted conflicts are extended cycles of action, counteraction, and experiential learning. And as a result, there is the ability of a belligerent to adapt rapidly and decisively, whether in terms of training tactics or overarching military strategy, is critical. As is often noted, Beijing has not fought a large-scale conflict since its mediocre performance during the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979. In addition, its relative lack of proximity with the world's most advanced and experienced Western militaries has deprived the PLA of the opportunity to sharpen its warfighting capabilities through sophisticated joint training. And indeed, the only experienced and technologically advanced military of which China currently engages in training for high-intensity warfare is Russia's, the general combat proficiency of which has now been somewhat called into question. Meanwhile, US troops regularly take part in highly realistic multinational warfighting exercises with a wide variety of international partners, providing them with the opportunity, in some cases, to gain experiential learning from their smaller allies' expertise in niche areas. And recent revelations over Beijing's intense efforts to recruit, for example, recently retired Western Air Force pilots to serve as trainers only reinforce the fact that there remains a qualitative gap in terms of capability and training between PLA personnel and their more combat experienced European and American counterparts. Furthermore, the increased politicization of the PLA under the leadership of a presidency, most notably the renewed emphasis on ideological indoctrination, high-level purges, and the empowerment of political commissars may come to undermine the professionalism of its officer corps or dilute their capacity for personal initiative and hence adaptability in combat. And I should actually just give a brief shout out to Shashank's publication, The Economist, that recently came out with an excellent report on some of these issues within the PLA. I believe it came out a few days ago. Yet, despite all these issues, I also argue quite strenuously in the book that there is no room for hubris. History has shown time and time again how determined adversaries can initially overcome an initial lack of expertise to obtain competitive levels of combat proficiency. One of the detailed historical examples I give, for example, is that of Rome's remarkable maritime transformation during the First Punic War, when after reverse engineering a Carthaginian vessel and initiating a mass naval armament and training program, Rome, a former land power with no navy to speak of, succeeded in durably wresting control of the Mediterranean away from its peer competitor. China, it is worth noting, does suffer from several severe and growing structural challenges, including resources, demography, and maintaining the sustained levels of economic growth essential to its regime's perceived legitimacy. Unlike the Soviet Union in its heyday, Beijing's ideational appeal remains limited. It can draw on no formalized alliance structures or large-scale overseas basing networks that would enable it to truly magnify its military reach overseas. So that's for the good news, if you will. Now for the bad news. I argue in the book that there are two aspects of the Sino-US competition that should foster grave and immediate concern in Washington as well as in allied capitals. The first is China's raw industrial might and the sheer scale and scope of its military buildup, which in many ways is historically unprecedented. Since the end of the Cold War, the US industrial base has severely atrophied, as has its merchant fleet, and a combination of cyber and supply chain vulnerabilities and critical materials such as rare earths, for example, have rendered US procurement far more exposed to internal disruption. The country's capacity to rapidly replenish munition stocks in the event of a protracted conflict is in serious doubt, and decades of underinvestment in logistics, from forward-positioned stocks to air and maritime connectors, mean that when it comes to guaranteeing its capacity for industrial resiliency, mobilization, military production, sustainment and regeneration, all factors that would prove increasingly critical in the event of a protracted conflict with China, the US is facing a severe uphill battle. If the US wishes to maintain a viable conventional deterrent in Asia, it will need to launch a once-in-a-generation construction and procurement effort, all while encouraging its even more industrially atrophied allies in Europe and Asia to do the same. In addition to reinvesting massively in its defense industrial base, merchant, marine, and logistical enablers, Washington will also need to focus on enlarging and upskilling its labor force, both through accelerated domestic education and training programs and via revamped bipartisan immigration policy. And given the level of investments required to even approach the intensity of China's shipbuilding efforts, the US may need to raise defense spending to well above its current levels, in addition to better leveraging the more robust shipbuilding capabilities of key allies such as Japan and South Korea. Secondly, the evolving Sino-Russian entente offers another cause for anxiety, or at least a combination of guarded wariness and careful contingency planning. For example, the prospect of Chinese military assets freely ranging from Russian submarine and air bases in the future would severely complicate US and allied operational planning. Furthermore, in the event of a Sino-US war, Russia, with its bountiful reserves of energy and grain, could emerge as China's great continental resource reservoir, providing it with the energy and foodstuffs it would require to mitigate the most damaging effects of any putative US-led maritime blockade. But my resigned belief is that there appears to be little at present that the US or its allies can do to generate fissures within this rapidly solidifying authoritarian axis. Both parties appear firmly united in their detestation of the West, believing that they have far more to gain than to lose from tightening their security cooperation. Whether this perception will prove accurate, especially in the case of the weaker partner, Russia, remains to be seen. So for now, Washington can do little more than closely monitor the relationship's development while trying to think more carefully through the full military ramifications of its potential maturation into a fully fledged alliance. Finally, and I'll conclude here, it goes without saying that none of the book's observations will obtain should the US succumb to a liberalism, fall victim to extreme polarization, or slip into an extended period of domestic dysfunction. In any protracted war with an authoritarian challenger, some of the US's most formidable competitive advantages would be its civic resilience, its values of openness, tolerance, and innovation, its network of democratic allies, and its capacity to engage in unified long-term planning across administrations. An America unmoored from its foundational values, estranged from its most capable long-standing allies, and unable to pass a budget in time, for example, and more generally riven by internal divisions, would have little chance of prevailing over its most formidable peer competitor. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iskander, for a kind of masterly tour through a very rich book and a very rich kind of set of arguments, which I'm sure will stimulate debate and discussion. And I should say, that Iskander's book, I think, is probably one of the first Adelphis to include detailed maps of, say, the course of the 100 Years' War. But as well as being a kind of rich historical examination of all of these fascinating factors in protracted war, it does remain firmly rooted in the present, and it really offers something for everyone. But I think I will now pass swiftly to Meia, my colleague Meia Nouwens, who is our Senior Fellow for Chinese Security and Defense Policy here at the Institute. Her expertise lies in Chinese cross-service defense analysis, China's defense industry and innovation, as well as China's regional strategic affairs and international relations. She leads our research here on China's digital Silk Road and was a co-lead of the China Security Project with the Mercator Institute for China Studies. She has previously worked for the European External Action Service as a policy officer in Taipei and as a trade analyst in the EU's delegation to New Zealand. She's also worked in many areas in the private sector and international organizations on topics of foreign policy, security and defense. And she holds degrees from Macquarie University, Leiden University, and the University of Oxford in conjunction with Peking University. Meia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ben. And let me first say congratulations to Iskander for the publication of your book. And of course, also to Ben and the team at the IISS for such a great piece of analysis. I think this is a really timely book, maybe just to kick off my remarks, not only because we're seeing, of course, we're undergoing in the West a protracted conflict in Europe, but on the other hand, also, I think it's timely in the sense that this is something that Beijing is observing very closely and is undoubtedly taking into consideration for potential planning and observations for a potential contingency in the Indo-Pacific region if one arises. I don't think we can conclusively say what we think those observations are, and I certainly don't want to use the words lessons learned when it comes to this, but there have been some changes in Beijing legally speaking, with new regulations and laws being passed with regards to defense mobilization, with regards to defense transportation laws as well. These are all mentioned in Iskander's book, so that's excellently noted. But similarly, I think there are observations here that from Beijing's perspective might not require changes and might actually confirm the utility and the importance of some of the reforms that have been taking place in the People's Liberation Army since 2016. Iskander notes a number of these changes within the PLA and force structure since 2016, and notes, of course, also that they were disruptive in certain ways. But we are now moving on from that, and I think that disruption is somewhat lifting, and we're now entering into a period where perhaps the PLA can start to consolidate on some of the structural and organizational changes to get back to addressing some of the weaknesses that are described in the book. For example, when it comes to joint training, streamlining perhaps better and even further command and control issues, so on and so forth. With regards to, I think, three things that I wanted to note in particular in my very short remarks. Firstly, on that issue of command and control, Iskander, you do talk about in your book the very important topic of PLA leadership and the dual command structure. The importance, I think, that we really can't forget, that this is, at the end of the day, not a national military, but a political armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. And the perhaps tension that brings into some of the command and control structures, but also at the end of the day, how this military may operate not just in peacetime or in crisis time, as we have seen so far, but what that means for conflicts and not the short and sharp and potentially immediately successful conflicts, but long protracted conflicts. Here, the fact that political commissars don't just lead and command theater commands, so 5 theater commands across the People's Liberation Army, but also that political representation is carried down all the way down to the company level. And this ideological turn that we've seen in China, the deepening of ideological importance of the CCP throughout the military, all the way down to lower levels of leadership and command, I think is going to be a problem that has not yet been resolved. Now, there is, as you note, a turn towards potentially intelligentization in the next few decades within the PLA, using emerging and disruptive technologies, smart systems to be able to perhaps go around some of those problems. You call it wishful thinking, I think, in your book. I would say that certainly the PLA isn't there yet, being able to operationalize and integrate these technologies at a full extent throughout the military, across all force service branches. But I think it's certainly something that they're looking into, as our militaries are as well, as a potential solution. That, of course, at the end of the day, from my perspective, isn't going to solve this problem that you have of needing to have a politically controlled military with an ideological focus. And adaptation, what adaptation looks like in the event of a conflict then becomes a real, I think, question. Secondly, in terms of morale and attrition, you discuss this in your book with regards to, I think, technology and equipment, the resilience within industry and society, and of course, also from a manpower and demographic perspective. There's one thing that I would add to that I think is important to note, and that's just morale within a society in general in a protracted conflict. Within China, you've noted the lack of military experience in a number, in the force in general, the lack of combat experience for the military, but also for the country, I would say. And if you think about some of the recent experiences that the PLA has had, for example, the border clash with India along the disputed border in 2020, I think here there's an interesting question about how the CCP itself views the resilience of morale within society. It took the Chinese leadership to around 8 months to announce that there were 4 casualties from that border dispute and the clash between the Indian and Chinese armed forces. That's quite a lot of time. And I wonder there whether there's perhaps a lack of trust or perhaps a nervousness and an anxiety as to how one would deal with attrition at a very large scale and a societal resilient response to that in the event of a protracted conflict. You note that there is a narrative of dealing with bitterness historically within Chinese society and leadership. At the moment, there's a lot of focus on the need to struggle. If you look at Chinese political documents and speeches, I think that's all true. But of course, at the end of the day, this is not something that you can exercise for or prepare for. It's just something almost that is a kind of like a stoplight, going to be a stoplight type of experience where people either deal with it or don't deal with it. You have to question how you sell the ultimate goal and the sacrifice to your country ahead of time. And it's interesting to be able to map that moving forward in China. The last thing that I wanted to touch on was alliances. And this is maybe a little bit of a segue to Shashank, giving a heads up that I'm wrapping up. But with regards to China's lack of alliance, other than its formal agreement with the DPRK, I think you were really right to note that China doesn't necessarily need to have alliances or need to have a formal alliance structure to be able to make use of some of its important bilateral relationships, such as with Russia, but potentially also with countries like Iran and, of course, also the DPRK, that these can be disrupting roles in the event of a protracted conflict, and that's something that needs to be thought about. You note the potential role here for Russia to provide apex military technologies to China that China does not yet master. I would say in the longer term, that's potentially not necessarily going to be a huge issue for the PLA anymore, operationally speaking. In terms of the defense industrial strength in China, there are so few areas of equipment left or technology left that they that they rely on Russia for, and that's going to just dwindle, I think, moving forward. But perhaps here the resilience of being able to integrate defense industrial production further moving forward, to be able to, as you said, improve supply chains and supply lines, that might be a point as well. And lastly, again, the picture of other supply chains aside from just defense that might help improve national resilience in the event of a protracted conflict, such as food and energy, as you noted, are going to be really important. Here, I do wonder if it's not an alliance. Again, if this happens, when it happens, what that bilateral relationship looks like is going to be very important. Levels of trust are still quite low, I would say, between the two, and military integration is certainly very low between the PLA and the Russian armed forces. So perhaps these are interesting and important things to monitor in the years to come, to be able to understand where we are along that timeline and those two extremes of no relationship and alliance between Russia and China. And at that, I'll leave my comments and hand over to Shashank and Ben.
Thank you so much, Meia, and for some very insightful kind of points and questions. And when we go into Q&A, Iskander, I may actually immediately turn to you and ask if you'd like to respond to any comments from our panelists, because I'm sure you'll have things to say. But first, I'd like to turn straight over to Shashank Joshi, our friend who is the Economist Defense Editor. Prior to joining The Economist in 2018, he served as a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute down the road, and he was a research associate at Oxford University's Changing Character of War programme. He has published books on Iran's nuclear program and India's armed forces, and he's written for a wide range of newspapers and journals and appeared regularly on radio and television, and he holds degrees from Cambridge and Harvard. Shashank.
Thanks so much for having me. First of all, Iskander, congratulations on this excellent book. I read it very briefly, very quickly, because it was such a breezy read and written so well. And it's one of the only books you'll find, I think, and perhaps Iskander's one of the only authors who can weave in nuanced analysis of the Sicilian expedition in the Peloponnesian War alongside the implications of joint all-domain command and control and its implications for a PLA-US conflict. So, and both of those handled as deftly as you'd expect with erudition. So congratulations, it's an excellent book and extremely thoughtful. And as I read it, my mind continually went back to so many of the topics I've been grappling with as a journalist, observing the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because of course that is a classic example of a protracted conflict. And I just want to begin with this question of expectations, the mismatch between expectations and reality in these conflicts. I remember talking to officials at the beginning of this year as Ukraine was preparing for its offensive, thinking was going into what the offensive might look like. And of course, even those planning for the offensive they understood perfectly well that this was going to be hard. They understood that Ukraine would have to overperform, Russia would have to underperform, and there could be a range of outcomes from a rout all the way to a catastrophe for Ukraine. But nonetheless, the operating assumption that was guiding the planning of the offensive was we need a major military blow to Russia that will force Russia to see that this war is unwinnable in some fashion, and that perpetuating it may cause them to lose their grip on what they have now. And this will open a political path to negotiations. In other words, there were expectations about the relationship between operational military activity and some kind of political outcome that would change the cost-benefit calculus of the adversary. That obviously completely failed, and it failed for a variety of reasons we can get into, because it's some of which are relevant to this question of intra-war learning. But I think one of the interesting questions is, what is our sense of war termination in a long conflict? You touch on this a little bit, but I'm interested to probe us on this a little bit more and to ask, when you have countries understanding whether this will be a long war or a short war as they begin it, how do they think it will end? And what is their theory of victory? And how does that change their strategy in a protracted conflict? Do they think that this will be political exhaustion, military exhaustion, economic exhaustion, societal exhaustion, some combination of these things? And how does that affect the dynamics you described? So that's my first point. The second one is on the nuclear overhang, the nuclear shadow, which I think is really fascinating. You know, Iskander, you and I have both studied South Asia and India and Pakistan defense scenarios. And of course, they mimic some of the old Cold War assumptions that the nuclear shadow compels short, sharp wars, because a long war raises nuclear risks in unacceptable ways. And that will drive you towards a short war in which things will be settled fast. And you, I think, quite sensibly point out it doesn't have to be that way. There are other pathways, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, that the restraint that nuclear weapons can induce in belligerents can actually drag a war on. It can push them towards strategies of warfare that are more slow, more gradual, more incremental, including things like distant blockade. And I was reading a paper by Fiona Cunningham that you cite her work in the monograph, and I think she suggests that a blockade could take months to enact, and it may have to be in place for 6 months in order to have any material effect on China. And already we can see that this is a far more protracted timescale than we often think of in these kind of conflicts, even with the nuclear shadow. But the thinking about nuclear weapons and the different ways in which we think about nuclear weapons on each side, on the Chinese side and the American side, made me think about a couple of other things as well. One of them is the asymmetry in how we think about risk and how that plays into the question of a protracted conflict. You point out that a protracted conflict drives the belligerents towards more brutal strategies quite often, right? It reduces moral compunctions, it erodes taboos, it drives each side to find new ways out of the conflict. And I wonder how that interacts with the situation we have in peacetime competition now, which is where one side in this rivalry sees risk as something to be manipulated to their benefit, right, in the form of close aerial encounters, naval encounters, a form of brinkmanship with which to coerce the other side into backing off. And I think we see this in the Black Sea with Russia as well. And we, in the West, see risk as a bad thing to be avoided at all costs, to be eliminated via guardrails, mill channels, communications. And how does that play in? Does our attitude change in a long war? Do our leaders and strategists effectively change their approach to risk? Or are we hobbled in that kind of long war in terms of taking a more risk-averse approach? And I think linked to that is our question of how strategically we think. You point out that one of the key diplomatic possibilities that China can exploit is the partnership with Russia. And the possibility of, you raised the possibility of diversionary action. How good are we as an alliance of thinking about diversionary action? In a major Pacific scenario, are NATO partners psychologically, intellectually capable of thinking in terms of offensive diversionary action in the Barents, in the North, in the Atlantic, in Eastern Europe, in the Mediterranean, that diverts Russian attention, lessening their ability to provide tangible support to China? Or are we strategically incapable of thinking of that because of the defensive strategic orientation of NATO and our alliances? Just a thought, you know, how does that attitude manifest in wartime? I'm interested. Third, shipbuilding. I think there's a tension in your argument between your conclusion that America is well-placed and the substantive arguments you make, which are that you end on the slightly gloomy note about America's internal political divisions, but you also point out the two big areas where the red lights are flashing: defense industrial base, including shipbuilding, and munitions production as well. And of course, you know, those are two enormous factors in a protracted conflict. On shipbuilding, some of you, you know, some of us may have seen the leaked slide out of the Office of Naval Intelligence in July that pointed out that China has 40% of the global commercial shipbuilding market. The US has about 0.5%. And there is this huge gulf in our ability to reconstitute naval losses. And naval platforms are some of the hardest things to reconstitute in a conflict. As someone pointed out to me recently, Russia and Ukraine are fighting with two completely different armies to the ones they began the war with. Armies can be reconstituted even in medium length campaigns and wars. Navies can't be. Navies can't be reconstituted in the same way. And that discrepancy in shipbuilding seems just a profound problem. And I'm not sure you point point to us a way out of it. I'm not sure you fully explain why you still have reasons for optimism, even under those circumstances of potentially high naval losses and high attrition. Although I think you rightly point out that South Korea and Japan and their very large shipbuilding industries do offer a kind of strategic depth within the alliance if it can be exploited. And one thing you don't tackle in as much detail is the specific attitude of allies, particularly in Europe, towards specific scenarios in which they may want to stay away. And of course, you will also have seen the commentary out of India this week by state-affiliated think tank officials that India's Navy should try and stay out of these scenarios as best as it can, and if it knows what's good for it. On a related subject of munitions, I'm not going to go into all of the incredible numbers that we have seen in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, except for one, which is that on the back of the envelope calculations I was looking at this week, American shell production, despite dramatic increases in output over the past year, over a doubling since February 22, and despite the dramatic ambitions for expansion over the next 18 months, US shell production in 2025, although high, will be lower than Russian shell production in 2024. So we're still looking at a pretty sclerotic kind of increase here, and some very serious questions to be asked about whether Europe is matching this pace of increase. And I think this is a serious problem given the timelines for a potential conflict in the Pacific, certainly that we see coming out of places like Indo-Pacific Command and the US military, even if there are significant differences and debates about timelines. And there's a great line I just wanted to read out from one of the recent issues of the British Army Review, written by the head of the British Army's Futures Command, James Bowder, trying to reconcile that our understanding of future war as being a contest of sensors and precision munitions with the arguments that you make, Iskander, which is you have to think about the day afterwards. And he says, there is a danger that the enemy will be able to generate more combat echelons than we have sensors or high-end weaponry to service, right? So I find we still have this kind of self-deluding line that says the Russians may be able to outproduce us on shells, but we have better shells. And to which I think, well, you may achieve 30 to 40% more efficiency with precision-guided shells, but the Russians are building them as well, and of course, so are the Chinese. And if they have 80% more than you, a 30 to 40% efficiency saving is not going to save you. So I still think we have a mentality problem when it comes to the depth of our munitions and magazine stockpiles. I was at DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters recently, and picked up debris from one of the Iranian Shahed drones. And I was asking experts, so you've got a platform here that is about $20,000 to produce, that has a 1,200 kilometer range and a payload of whatever it is. Tell me again, what do we have in our collective Western arsenals that matches this? And the answer is, of course, absolutely nothing at the same level on the cost curve. And we're beginning to address this problem through things like Project Replicator in DoD, which looks to mass produce cheap precision-guided munitions. But it seems to me that we're still well behind in our thinking as to how we begin to generate the basis for combat mass in a durable, sustainable way, and in a way that can be ramped up in a conflict. Finally, very last point before I shut up, which is intra-war learning. This is a very important part of your paper, I think. It was a very important part of Michael Howard's writings as well. He's had the famous line about how for a military officer, it's like a surgeon who has to operate having perhaps only practiced one operation in his whole life, or none at all. And that question of, it's the question of how quickly do you learn in a war often makes the difference. And we have great examples like Israel in the Yom Kippur War being able to learn with incredible speed, essentially allowing it to turn around a terrible start to a campaign. My question is, what do we take from the Ukraine example, where it strikes me we have not always been that good, or as good as we'd like to believe, on intra-war learning? And I look back at the offensive and some of the analysis of why this Ukrainian offensive has failed, and I just want to read out a line from a paper by Rusi, if that's not too heretical at this institution, which was by one of their excellent papers looking at operational analysis of the war. And they wrote, much of the data supporting the tactics that Ukraine's international partners sought to train Ukrainian forces to adopt was based on operational analysis from the 20th century that did not contend with a range of technologies employed in Ukraine. In other words, we screwed up badly. We gave the Ukrainians advice based on out-of-date assumptions, poor data, and a failure to understand the nature of the battlefield in terms of sensors, Lancet drones, the depth of mines. And I guess my question is, what do we take from that? And how do we ensure that in an actual war that we are involved in, we are able to learn more quickly and more effectively than we have been able to help the Ukrainians do in this one? Thank you. I'll stop there.
Shashank, thank you so much for kind of a range of very penetrating, insightful questions. Now, I'm well aware that we have about 15 minutes left, and Iskander could easily spend 15 minutes just going through a few of those questions. If anyone in the audience does want to ask questions, now is the time to get them in, because there's already a couple there, and I think we will struggle to get through many more. So please do send them in now while you have the chance, or forever hold your peace. While people are generating that, Iskander, I'll turn to you and say, rather than trying to answer all of those in 10 seconds each, which is impossible, I wonder if there's any you'd like to riff on a bit to just, that really kind of captivated you, or that you think merit kind of further discussion.
Cool. Well, thanks, first of all, for an incredibly generous, rich, and incisive set of comments. With regard to some of the issues that Meia raised, I definitely don't want to give the impression that I'm not concerned about the scale and scope of Chinese investments in cutting-edge technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, quantum computing, their focus on what they call the intelligentization of warfare, which is always rather hard to pronounce, and prevailing in the cognitive confrontation. I think it's certainly something that we should be tracking, monitoring, and be extremely concerned about, just considering the scale and scope, as I mentioned, of Chinese investments. I think we should also be more concerned more broadly about how authoritarian societies with less ethical guardrails, let's say, when it comes to issues such as autonomy and artificial intelligence, may be willing to push certain technological boundaries in quest of warfighting advantage that might make us as Western democratic societies somewhat uncomfortable. I guess my only point was to say that occasionally, and Meia can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a sinologist, so I rely on the work of her and her colleagues, but it does appear that in a lot of PLA military writings, there is a certain amount of wishful, or let's say magical thinking, and that there is a sense that by investing extensively in these technologies, it will suffice to sort of help burn through some of the fog and friction of warfare, and to sort of introduce a more seamless, rapid, and effective decision-making process on the battlefield. With regard to the Sino-Russian Entente, yes, I completely agree that there are lingering suspicions and apprehensions on both sides of this relationship that are occasionally revived when, for example, some bizarre maps will be produced by the Chinese government, which seem to indicate that Russian territory is Chinese. But I think that we can also acknowledge that we are seeing a much closer military intelligence and security relationship in between China and Russia than we have in the past, whether it's, for example, air and naval patrols off the coast of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, joint bomber patrols in the Sea of Japan, etc. And so, as both of the discussants raised during their comments, I do think that it's something that we collectively need to think through, not just politically, but also operationally. What would, for example, Russia granting Chinese assets permanent access to bases in the North Pacific, what would that mean for US and allied force posture in the region? How could that generate new dilemmas that we should be aware of? Now, turning very briefly to Shashank's very thoughtful set of comments. I completely agree that we need to think a lot more about the issue of war termination. In fact, I might suggest that IISS commission a new Adelphi book from someone on the issue of war termination when it comes to a putative Sino-US conflict, because it's definitely something that is underexplored in large part because it boils down to the same reticence. We don't necessarily like to think after the first salvo and to think through the full ramifications of a conflict. I think that it's particularly difficult in the sense that, as we've seen with Russia and Ukraine, countries' war aims can fundamentally change in accordance with the ebb and flow of conflict. The most famous example is, for example, the peace conferences held in Westphalia. All parties continued fighting while they were negotiating. And depending on the ebb and flow of their fortunes on the battlefield, their positions would become more or less maximalist. And so it can be very hard from the get-go, before a conflict actually begins, to fully gauge what a country's negotiating position might be. With regard to the industrial issue, yes, I certainly don't want to give the impression that this is a roseate, optimistic study. Instead, I was trying to be as even-handed as possible in my analysis, to not be too doom and gloom, but to not be too sanguine either. I think that there is a difference, though. There is a difference when one points to the sort of fundamentals of a country's position, the fundamentals of American primacy, which remains strong. And then other issues such as the industrial issue, which are cause for enormous concern, but which I think, provided we inject sufficient political willpower and funding, are not impossible to remedy. It will be very, very challenging to do so, but it's not a situation that will be impossible to remedy. China's demographic and resource-related challenges, I think, are much more fundamental in the sense that they would be much more challenging to overcome. Just yes, to give a few troubling factoids on the state of the U.S. defense industry. During the Second World War, which is the historical analog that people often turn to, the U.S. could, of course, rely on the colossal latent capacity of its civilian industrial sector. At the time, the United States was the world's leading producer of manufactured goods and steel. That obviously is no longer the case. In the 1950s and 1960s, roughly 1 in 3 Americans worked in manufacturing. Now that's closer to 1 in 10. It's much harder to convert civilian industries to defense uses, given the growing sophistication of defense equipment. China, as you rightly mentioned, is the top ship producing in the world by tonnage. It manufactures more than half the world's commercial ships and 96% of the world's dry shipping containers. And the Chinese Navy is larger in terms of overall combatants than the US Navy. And it doesn't look like that gap is going to narrow anytime soon. In fact, it's going to widen. That being said, I do think, as you also mentioned, that while the state of the US shipbuilding industry is most definitely cause for concern, the US is somewhat fortunate in that 2 of its closest allies, South Korea and Japan, are amongst the world's most effective shipbuilders. And I mean, that's something I explore in greater depth in the book. For reasons of time, I won't get into it here. But more generally, I think that the US should be looking more extensively at opportunities to engage in joint munition and platform production with its allies, to leverage some of its allies' industrial capacities as well as its own.
Thank you so much, Iskander. And I'm sure as there's a lot more that we could talk about the wide range of questions that both Meia and Shashank have raised. Mindful of time, I probably only can take a couple of questions from the audience. I will note that a few of them are along the lines of what might cause such a war, which I think certainly raises the question of leadership intentions and mentalities during a war and how that may affect risk calculations. I should perhaps note in passing that the chairman of our trustees, Bill Emmett, will next year publish an Adelphi book in this series on Deter but Engage, see how great power war might be prevented. But I suppose if we can't prevent it, then we'll have to be thinking along these lines of how we're going to manage it. I have a comment here from Wright Smith, who is at MIT, who asked, can you speak about whether the naval-centric nature of a possible US-China protracted war differs from some of the historical examples that we tend to think that were land-based, i.e. the First World War, the Iran-Iraq, present-day Russia-Ukraine? I have a suspicion, given some of Iskander's interests, how he might answer this question, but I would like him to answer this first.
Sure. So I think that there are unfortunately a number of potential scenarios that could lead to conflict in between the United States and China, whether it's with regard to Taiwan, of course, which is the scenario that people invoke the most frequently, especially at the moment, but also over the Senkaku Jiayu Islands that are disputed in between Japan and China, and the US supports Japan on this issue, obviously. Japan is a treaty ally, but also more recently, we've seen some troubling developments around Thomas Shoal, which is a contested reef in between China and the Philippines. So there are a number of issues which could draw the US and China into conflict. What concerns me the most is something that Shashank actually touched upon in his remarks, which is China's greater appetite for risk and brinkmanship, and its willingness, as Thomas Schelling would have said, to weaponize the threat that leaves something to chance. And I touched upon this during my presentation. I said that there have been a record number of incidents where Chinese air and naval platforms have been operating very dangerously close to not only US, but also allied vessels throughout the region. And when you engage in such close proximity and engage in such risky behaviors, there's always the risk of a new P3 incident and of something, of inadvertent escalation. I am somewhat reassured that recently China seems to have agreed to reopen military-to-military communications, and also that the Biden administration and the PRC have held their first arms control and nuclear-related talks since the Obama administration. So there does seem to be some evolution on the Chinese side. And I think that could be extremely helpful in helping diffuse an already tense situation.
I was wondering if you might also remark a little bit about the question about maritime versus land-based.
Oh yes,
or whether that affects your analysis significantly.
So I mean, yes, it's true that if we look, well, I think if you look at, for example, the Pacific theater in World War II, that was very maritime focused, and there are an enormous amount of lessons and parallels that one can draw from a closer study of that era. And incidentally, Chinese strategists spend a lot of time studying US campaigns during World War II. It's a topic of great interest for them, as well as the Falklands War, for example. Lyle Goldstein, who was at the Naval War College, I think he's somewhere else now, but he's produced an excellent study on Chinese lessons from the Falkland War, which I would highly recommend. And Toshi Yoshihara at CSBA has also produced an excellent monograph on how PLA analysts look at US campaigns in World War II. Another example I would point to, given my intellectual preferences, is the Punic Wars, which I think are completely underexplored in our broader strategic community. People seem to reflexively turn to Thucydides, but I would recommend also reading Polybius and studying the First Punic War in particular, which was heavily maritime focused. And in fact, some of the battles, some of the naval battles in the First Punic War, still remain some of the largest naval battles in history.
Iskander, we have a large range of questions, including about perhaps the effect of the US failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, about Israel and Hamas, but I'm mindful of the time. And although this could be a very protracted webinar, I must also consider webinar termination very firmly. Just before we wrap up, I just want to thank you again for producing such a wonderful book. It's been a real pleasure producing it. We're delighted to publish it. ISS members should soon receive a hard copy of it through the post. If you're not an ISS member, then first of all, consider applying for membership. If you would like to order it from Amazon or Routledge, as I said, you will receive a discount code for Routledge. If it's still glitching today, please do try it tomorrow. The elves at Taylor and Francis are working hard to fix it as we speak. And in any case, you can download your copy on Kindle right now. And I do recommend that you do so and read and engage in important work. I'd like to thank Shashank, Joshi and Meia Nouwens for giving their time today to give such fascinating and interesting contributions to this discussion. I really enjoyed hearing what they have to say. And thank you again, Iskander, and thank you all for joining us today.